A train comes to a halt. A male figure with a spiked helmet decorated by a fountain of dark plumes exits the train and greets an equally imposing dignitary with a similar headgear. The two men embrace. Then the Kaiser speeds forward, followed by his fluttering head cover, moving in a direction perpendicular to the train, where he greets a long procession of other festively decorated personages aligned parallel to the train. Similar geometric agglomerations of trains, horse carriages, military uniforms, and plumed headgear would be endlessly repeated during the Kaiser's official visits to many German cities, where this animated menagerie would attempt to consolidate a political hegemony based equally on military hierarchy and festive ornamentation. The former acts as an ornamental envelope of the latter, and vice versa. Just like Wilhelm's Pickelhaube, or spiked helmet, turned from military headgear to a ceremonial parade accessory by the unscrewing of the spiked top, and its replacement by a Trächte mit Feder, or the Haarbusch, a tall metal attachment with a feather or hair extension. Similar to the political order that it strived to support, the headgear was oscillating peripherally at its edges between pageantry and military action, and could perform such precipitous return with the addition of a composite appendage that was inorganic at its core, yet had animal or animate, lifelike, peripheral, radiating extensions. Historians and biographers describe the love of Kaiser Wilhelm II for hats and other military and aero-festive headgear, which are used to conceal his withered left arm behind ornamental covers. As is well known, the Kaiser's left arm was battered during his ill-fated breech birth, in which the doctor pulls the baby from its feet that may result to injury of either arms and shoulders. The same arm having further deteriorated after a series of excruciating treatments on the young boy, and whose end result was the stunted growth of the young Kaiser's left arm to 15 centimeters shorter than his right arm and capable only of partial movement. The impairment of his left arm was apparently a source of great physical and psychological distress for the Kaiser, who attempted to conceal it in official portraits by holding his atrophied limb with his right arm, or by wearing long wristbands and or holding gloves, or a sword, attempting to compensate the loss of the arm's length with a prosthetic extension of a weapon. Weapons, Waffen, writes the architect Gottfried Semper in Der Still, are not simply useful implements, but, quote, the true adornment of man. Der wahre Schmuck des Mannes, end quote, pointing to the primeval relation between ornament and weaponry. Semper had in fact described a series of swords, guns, and other ornaments in a report on the Queen's private collection of arms at Windsor Castle when he was in exile in London as part of his duties for the Department of Practical Art. And his archive contains a number of detailed drawings of such specimens which, with the introduction of ballistic weaponry in warfare, were destined to become gradually obsolete. That is, decorated ornaments rather than weapons. In Wilhelm's case, the decorated artifact complements the atrophied limb, which in its compromised state is essentially another less desirable accessory. Yet it is the asymmetrical double of this atrophied limb, that is the king's raised right arm extended by the direction and ornament of the sword, that popular biographies and television documentaries unfeigningly figure point as directing Wilhelm's ferocious propensity for military action that led Germany to the First World War and whose outcome marked the end of this festive pageantry. A similar ornamental atrophy describes the monarch's condition after the end of the Great War, when, fast forward a few years, when he was forced to abdicate and lived in exile in Holland. Here the cover of his memoirs, published in 1922, a book that belongs to the Warburg Library as well, a book whose pages, like the decorative items that the Kaiser once wore, masterfully conceal the unrepentant monarch's many weaknesses and calamitous decision. While stripped from all festive regalia, the former Kaiser had himself become a smooth, modernized ornament. Since he had lost all political power, yet he would continue experiencing this rudimentary afterlife for approximately 20 more years. The sword had now been reduced into a walking stick, further accessorized not by cavalry horse, but by Darwin's domestic animal par excellence, his dog. Known as the last Kaiser, Wilhelm's death in 1941 marks the end of his species. In their book, L'évolution régressive en biologie et en sociologie, published in 1897, English translation, Evolution by Atrophy, of 1899, social and natural theories from the Institute of Sociology at Brussels, de Moor, Massard, and Van de Velde, describe how previously well-developed animal organs gradually atrophy and are reduced into rudiments that sometimes pose as ornamental extensions. The phenomenon of progress due to partial regression was a supplement, if not an alternative, to the evolutionary theories of Darwin, who had also demonstrated the importance of rudimentary organs in his Origin of the Species and the Descent of Man. Quote, rudimentary organs may be compared with the letters in a word, still retained in the spelling, but have become useless in the pronunciation, yet which still serves as a clue for the word's derivation, end quote, writes Darwin in The Origin of the Species. These hushed and seemingly superfluous letters are of value then to the etymologist, in the same manner that rudimentary organs were of immense value to the evolutionist and ornaments or material vestiges to the historians of adornment, art, and culture. But if linguistic, biological, and decorative vestiges were useful to the etymologist, the biologist, and the cultural historian, what use were these rudiments of for the speaker, the animal, and the human carrier of such resilient remnants? Employing examples from plants and certain species of crustaceans, the three Belgian scientists of regressive evolution described the manifold transformations, including certain gains, produced by the loss of vital extensions in vegetal, marine, and terrestrial organisms, and with an emphasis in the transformation of fingers and toes during the development of quadrupeds, all of which acquire a new formal and functional identity while in a partially atrophying state. One of the most telling examples used is that of a certain species of lungfish that developed from lethargic and heavy aquatic organisms into swift water snakes while gradually losing their large fins. These aquatic organisms still have minuscule fins, as you see, but what had previously been functional organs now were vestigial accessories, semi-organic extensions, inert, and yet set in movement by the water as the fish swims. The main lesson of evolution regressive was that in order to take 2 steps forward, an organism had to take at least 1 step back. The Belgian scientists did not see regression as a deviation from the way of nature, as certain popular histories of evolution, here Carus Sterners, aka Ernst Krause, werden und vergehen, coming into being and passing away, or just simply becoming and perishing, portrayed rudiments such as superficial mammae, hair, or even tails as evidence of monstrosity and degeneracy with evident racial overtones. On the contrary, the Belgian scientists saw atrophy and regression as the viable presupposition for progress. In order to gain something, an organism had to lose something else. There could be no evolution without devolution. No progress could be performed without recoil. Next to fish, plants, and animals, the scientists' most vivid examples from the side of human societies come from the side of human societies and political systems, including contemporary atrophying human institutions, such as a number of European monarchies or the system of sheriffs in England, that managed to survive for centuries or even thrive through costumes, pageantry, and festival decorations, lately royal babies as well, at the same time that their gubernatorial power of the same institutions was being radically diminished. An example here for Warburg's native city of Hamburg, where, as the historian Mark Russell has pointed out, Hamburg senators who, quote, after 1860 had little interest for full official uniforms, after 1890, and when their authority was challenged by the emerging social democrats, supported by the lower classes, they went back to full 16th century costume whenever they had to appear in front of the public in ceremonial occasions, end quote. Here, the well-known painting of the senators in 16th century regalia at the Hamburg Rathaus by Hugo Vogel of 1904, commemorating an occasion of 1897. Here, a projective weakening of power produced the efflorescence of ornamentation. Developed during the turn of the century, theories of regressive evolution are close to an era that was about to witness the abrupt demise and transference of power during major political, social, and cultural revolutions, accompanied by historic art and architectural transformations. But what happens, however, to these ornamental rudiments after such revolutions have occurred? Do they survive, perish, or transform into something entirely different? Unlike the representatives of Werden und Vergehen, the atrophied organisms of regressive evolution appear to neither become nor perish. They were just hanging there, the very indecipherability of their potential movement becoming an ominously oscillating sign. Were they the decorative representatives of a conservative obstinacy and persistence, or could the same resilient rudiments ultimately act as catalysts for major organic transformations and change? There are several theoretical and many anthropological treatises at the turn of the century that attempt to describe an evolution or a life history and even make a contribution to a biology of ornament, as if ornamentation was an organism that went through various transformations. One of the first to use evolutionary terms to describe ornaments was Gottfried Semper. In his 1856 essay on the formal principles of Adornment über die formelle Gesetzmäßigkeit des Schmuckes und dessen Bedeutung als Kunstsymbol, that starts by mentioning the bone-ear pendants of the Botocundo in eastern Brazil, and which Semper characterized as the rudiments, the udimente, of the graceful Ionic ear pendants of antiquity. Following his references to tattooing, Semper also mentioned female blue stockings, which you see there, as, quote, the vestiges, Spur, of the blue paint that Celtic women applied on their legs, a Stoffwechsel, a material change that rehearses in reverse his theory of cladding or Bekleidung from weaving to color coding. The architect celebrates the ancient plumed helmet of the Greeks and the Romans as one of the preeminent examples of directional ornament. Yet he laments that its contemporary survival, the late 19th century Bavarian caterpillar helmet, Raupenhelm, the rich plumed top is now stultified, verkümmert, into a, quote, quivering, short, cropped horsehair sausage, zu wackelnden, kurzgeschorenen Haarwüsten. The shift from Raupenhelm to Pickelhaube mit Treste und Haarbusch would apparently fix the decorative volume. Semper attempted to counteract the impending atrophy caused by the aberrant effects of the 19th century industrialization by finding recourses to the principles of nature, such as the cosmic forces of gravity, directionality, and movement. And here's where the curved forms of biological rudiments intersect with the straight line of mechanics and statics in natural science. A set of perpendicular axes with all four cardinal points marked by a capital letter. A horizontal arrow pointing to the left next to a vertical line segment. A rectangle with two dotted lines, a diagonal which is also dotted. And below all of the above, the small drawing of a tree above the sketch of a human figure with arms semi-extended. All four of these minuscule sketches are part of a page of manuscript notes by Aby Warburg from his reading of Gottfried Semper. Specifically, the architect's 1856 aforementioned essay on Adornment, Schmuck, marked as read in the fall of 1890 in Berlin, yet following his reading of Semper's voluminous opus of Der Stil, which apparently Warburg read for the first time while he was in Florence in November of 1888, under the tutelage of August Schwarzkopf. While Warburg has only 4 pages of notes from the voluminous style, which is over 1,000 pages, he has no less than 14 pages of notes from the architect's rather slim 30-page essay on adornment. Semper's lecture, presented as you see here in front of a mixed public in Zurich, including women, was published with no illustrations, and so perhaps at a point when the architect's former theoretical exposition was becoming too abstract, the art historian felt the need to illustrate it, and so he drew these little sketches. Reading the manuscript notes, we understand that the axes at the top stand for the two pairs of opposite cosmic forces, gravity versus life force, Schwerkraft and Lebenskraft, as well as movement and resistance. The arrow jotted underneath connotes precisely resistance and is perpendicular to the axis of growth. The formal product of the strife between movement and growth is shown in the tree, which has a planimetric type of symmetry versus the linear symmetry of man, the only living being, says Semper, who moves perpendicular to the axis of its growth, unlike the fish, for example, or the worm mentioned here in Warburg's note. Warburg's notes then reconstruct a micrography of the natural world, a miniature of cosmic forces reduced into the space of a single page. Man is either the culmination of the composite rudiment of mineral, vegetal, and animal movement or processes of growth, here reinscribed as geometric linear procession. Orientation becomes ornamentation, and the scholar's art historical investigation turns into a graphic yet reflective jewel. Notice that the term used by Semper in his lecture title is in fact not ornament, but schmuck. That is a decorated artifact pertaining mainly to bodily adornment, such as a piece of jewelry or a headdress, because for Semper, ornament cannot be a flat, disembodied pattern, as it was mainly portrayed by Owen Jones in his 1856 Grammar. Instead, it has to be a real artifact that has weight and physical dimensions, and with its movement and direction, inscribes itself into the natural and the man-made world, and becomes artfully part of its ecological system. Semper, in fact, starts his lecture with that world through an etymological definition of the Greek word cosmos. Here, in Semper's own handwriting, in Greek, 2 times, as you see, from his original manuscript on Adornment, which means both the creation and the world in order, and we see Warburg here transcribing precisely that phrase by Semper on Greek cosmos in his own notes. The cosmos here might be another cosmic rudiment of Semper's reading of Humboldt, here from Semper's list of personal books sent to America. Humboldt's cosmos contains more than a page on the manifold meanings of the word cosmos. The Greek lexicon by Schneider that Semper owned interprets cosmos, quote, as order and arrangement, Ordnung, Anordnung, as well as decoration, Schmuck, plus discipline or direction, Einrichtung, something that not simply beautifies but organizes and arranges the world, including the world of knowledge. For ornament functions as an epistemological artifact, even if the knowledge it reflects often works by a sort of exclusion or total bedazzlement, as I will argue. And would further argue that for Semper, the ancient cosmos is the representative of mainly 2 epistemological faculties, 2 worlds or 2 disciplines that were parallel but different, and whose material the architect selectively fielded or ecologically stringed into his own theoretical and historiographic adornment. First was the classical world of ancient philology, which is here. From which Semper drew his not always accurate Greek etymologies, as well as decorative patterns after ancient Greek models. Second was the world of modern physics, the abstract world of physical forces in which the world of ancient philology would gradually transform into. This is a geometric world that was just witnessed in Warburg's notes and sketches, a mixture of Semper's contemporary physics and Schopenhauer's Naturphilosophie or metaphysics in its mid-19th century guise. This was also the world of traveling comet tails and ancient missiles that the architect had analyzed following his studies of physics and mathematics before he lectured about Schmuck, and which Semper, following his political exile from Dresden to London, studied along with the movement of ancient slickshot projectiles, translating the celestial dynamics of the comet to the earthly polemics of world physics and contemporary military technologies. Yet, next to this world of cosmic forces, Semper also witnessed the intrusion of another world, which was the Earth at large, whose geographic continuity was ornamentally yet asymmetrically rearranged in the architect's era. Semper's very first example of bodily adornment, as mentioned earlier, are the Bodecundo of eastern Brazil, known from several ethnological descriptions of the early 19th and previous centuries. The Bodecundo protract their lower lip and earlobes, quote, to alarming lengths by inserting in them wooden plugs, bones, seashells, and the like, Semper writes. Empathy theorists at the time described decorative objects as imaginative extensions of the bodily self. In the Bodokundo, though, the inorganic object is not an extension, but an insertion. The body itself has to protract and literally incorporate the artifact. Semper continues by mentioning similarly invasive techniques of piercing with sticks in Aztecs in Mexico and in Peru, as well as tattooing and scarification practices in Africa and around the world. Semper then implies that the origin of the drive for decoration, Verzierungstrieb, as he calls it, is not in empathetic abandonment and pleasure, but on the resistance, pain, and stretching of the body to limits that lie beyond its normative periphery. The architect then examines apotropaic masks in several ancient cultures, including the Gorgon mask of the Greeks. The purpose here of bodily enhancement is not to attract, but to repel, to ward off connections with other objects of the external environment. The ornament holds back and holds together the world by the aesthetic dynamics of both attraction and repulsion, similar to the physical laws that regulate the movement of inorganic materials. In that line, Semper also mentions the practice of wearing amulets, and he speculates that perhaps the very origin of decoration lies in the frame or the chain set around the amulet to hold the artifact together, which later becomes autonomous when the amulet was replaced by another artifact or by a gem. If that is correct, then what we call decoration and beauty, as Freud and more recently Hubert Amish would remind us, has an ugly and repellent core or origin. Both ethnography then and archaeology and classical philology are the main sources of knowledge about schmuck for Semper, but so are physics. All three of these cosmic faculties allow the architect to formulate three universal categories of adornment, which expand from the New Zealander to the Greek, since both of them, according to Semper, wear the same headgear. All three of these categories of ornaments, here are listed by Warburg, have to do with movement, Bewegung. First, the pendant, or behang, is an oscillating apparatus whose palindromic movement accentuates the cosmic law of gravity, Schwerkraft, and therefore Semper calls it a macrocosmic ornament. Then, the ring, or annular ornament, which emphasizes proportional relations between different parts in an individual body, and therefore Semper calls it microcosmic ornament. While relatively static or fixed, it implies radial movement of expansion, as is the neck collar of the ancient Egyptians. Finally, Semper's third category, that thus far had no name, and which is movement incarnate, is the so-called directional ornament, Richtungsschmuck, emphasizing bodily and projective orientation in space. Semper calls these ornaments the most spiritual, die geistigere, of all ornaments because they are the most active in terms of agency, containing, quote, the movement, the expressions, and the character of the carrier. As in the Assyrian reliefs from Nimrud that Semper would have seen in the British Museum while in exile in London. The directional ornament inscribes a projective, diagrammatic type of movement in both space and time. That adds a second projective contour on the ornamented animal or human carrier and extends their spatial circumference beyond their corporeal limits. Associated with military hierarchy and the regimented space of the battlefield, where the need for orientation becomes vital, directional ornaments were the cosmic signs of a world in flux, in which more static ornamental forms, such as rings and pendants, were becoming obsolete. And these directional ornaments evidently redirect us back to Warburg. In the direction of his doctoral dissertation under formation when he read Semper in 1888 and 1990, and which, as is well known, dealt with a seemingly non-directional movement of accessories in motion. Semper does mention fabric in his essay, which, when they don't hang down like pendants, but are freely attached to the bodies or the columns as festive decorations, as examples of directional ornaments, and Warburg copies precisely that passage, as we see here. However, the main difference, I would argue, between Warburg's mobile accessories and Semper's directional schmuck is that the former display no particular order, physical or otherwise. On the contrary, the mobile accessory, or beiwerk, is the etheric sign of a generalized disorder, a deviant decorum produced by the economy of the modern world. This was a sign of an artful yet chaotic world that was becoming increasingly ornamental and not ornamented in Semper's cosmic sense. The very fabric of the world was constantly changing. Theorists of culture, from Semper to Warburg, tried to decipher that new texture by dissecting its mobile edges, the fabric appendages of adornment, which in spite of their pseudo-decorative qualities were now oscillating like pendants between cosmos and chaos, from which the ancient cosmos had emerged and the modern one threatened to fall back into. Perhaps this lost order, signaled by the aberrantly manneristic Renaissance accessory, could be restored in the cosmic symbolism of annular and directional ornaments worn by Pueblo natives of the American Southwest that Warburg visited and studied a few years after he completed his dissertation in 1895 and 1896, and who seemed to be carrying the world on their head by means of their cosmological headgear. Yet it is another here accessory, the stovepipe hat of Uncle Sam walking downtown Market Street in San Francisco amidst electricity wires, a hat whose cosmic significance is amplified in Warburg's photographic framing by the neo-Renaissance rotunda in the background, transforming Uncle Sam into a neo-Renaissance figure that marks a new form of directionality. Yet again, such directionality is symptomatically slanted, as disclosed by the tilting axis in Warburg's instantaneous camera frame, signaling the deviation from the axis of gravity in this technological neo-Renaissance urban vision. But let us now trace the legacy of Semper's essay on adornment beyond Warburg. Such legacy appears to replicate the architect's palindromic movement between the ascending polyrhythmy of the Bodocundo and the classic order of the Greeks. Yet even this classical world had changed and needed a modern translation. J. Matthias' The Human Ornament updates Semper's three ornamental categories by citing the contemporary application, quote, in domestic and industrial circles, yet he illustrates them, as you can see, with examples from museum collections of Schmuckgegenstände in Berlin. Quote, he wants to reawake the proper sense of ornament in housewives, end quote, writes Warburg in his notes from Matthias' book. And furthermore, he complains, basiert auf Semper ohne zu zitieren. He's based on Semper without citing him. Zitieren, sorry. Indeed, while the author copies Semper's categories, he never once mentions Semper's name. But perhaps Matthias' shameless plagiarism has an explanation. In an age of ornament's mechanical reproduction, questions of authorship eventually become irrelevant. Semper's categories of adornment had fallen victim of the same ornamental treatment which his types were invented to oppose. Together with Semper's name, Matthias also meets Semper's cosmological agenda. Ornament had now moved into the modern world even by wearing a classical helmet, an ancient fragment that was becoming increasingly allegorical, yet it continued to be practically applied. However impoverished an account, Matthias' Human Ornament is typical of an abundance of treatises, histories, and exhibition catalogues on schmuck, published during the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries, and constitute this long written legacy or litany of world ornament. These fully illustrated histories record the mobility of ornament around the world, both Occidental and increasingly non-Western. Like Matthias, many times the male authors of these histories dedicate the lavishly ornamented books to their wives, meine Frau. But unlike Matthias, who divided ornament according to Semper's three universal categories of ornament, these surveys examine schmuck mostly chronologically and in geographic regions, following the model of Owen Jones's well-known grammar of ornament. Many of them start with Neolithic ornament, such as this necklace with perforated boar and wolf teeth, mussel shells, and fishbone vertebrae, which historians compare to contemporary tribal ornament. For example, the so-called chain of the Kafir from South Africa, a string necklace made of hanging roots, twigs, perforated teeth, bird feathers, hair balls, white European glass balls, and the mouthpiece of a European tobacco pipe broken. The Kafir chain was another annular ornament, encircling the landscape of adornment based on material exchange. Like a bird collecting natural materials from its environment, the necklace here creates a uniquely portable ecology, an oxymoron in and of itself. While anchored into the world, it recreates a mobile miniature model of the world, or accessory peripheral or eccentric microcosm by the means of a material aggregate. Most of the new material contained in such ornamental surveys came from an abundance of new evidence originating both in the colonies and in archaeological sites, often exhibited side by side in museum collections along historical specimens of schmuck from Europe. Ornament's ecological mobility, historians tell us, changed entirely with the use of metal and later precious stones that even though they are still objects of exchange, they have a permanency, an age cycle that is very different from that of the vegetal root. In the words of philosopher Michael Mather, ecology was substituted by economy, the fixing not only of place but also value on a formerly itinerant entity. However, the 19th century seems to have further increased the mobility of ornament, not simply in terms of empowerment, but also its functional obsolescence. Attempting to divest it from functional value, 19th century historians of ornament find it important to distinguish between schmuck and gerät, which means tool, utensil, or practical implement. They argue that for an object to become schmuck, it should have no other role than adornment and beautification and nil practical utility or value. The decorated comb, for example, worn by a woman is schmuck as long as she merely wears it on her hair. The moment she uses it to comb her hair, it becomes an implement or a gerät. If we wear a watch as a pendant and admire it for its decorative artifact closed in its decorated cover, then it's a schmuck. But when we open it to look at the time, it too turns into a tool or a gerät. These examples perhaps show that however timely these distinctions are rather fragile and changeable, since there are these objects that obviously are both schmuck and gerät, such as the so-called Schaugeräte, vases or other artifacts, most of them coming from the East, where these distinctions do not hold, and other of these functional implements that are made almost exclusively for display, such as this heavily gilded punch bowl designed by none other than Semper. I know it's hard to imagine, in his style, and figuring prominently enough to appear on the cover of the Getty Research Institute's English edition designed by Bruce Mau. Such objects wear, so to speak, their previous use as decoration on their surface. Non-use becomes the additional luster, enhancing the prestige of the ornamented artifact. Schmuck is then the rudiment of a previous tool, created not by the atrophy, but here the very hypertrophy of decoration. What appears as the artifact's organic extensions attach to it a ceremonial, lethargic inactivity, an inorganic immobility caused not by the atrophy, but the hypertrophy of its decorative extensions. Hypertrophy and atrophy are two terms that apply not in the practice, but also in the theorization and historiography of ornament as well. Another book on schmuck, based on Semper's 1856 lecture, is Emil Selenka's Der Schmuck des Menschen, The Ornament of People, published in 1900 in Berlin. And this book, as most of my previous sources, are included among Warburg's bibliographic notes that you see here from his Zettelkästen, just as the Belgian sociologist and biologist Evolution Regressive mentioned earlier was also part of his library. And the phrase, in fact, the Evolution Regressive, is repeated by Warburg a number of times in his writings, including the memoirs from his American journey. Like Semper, Selenka, a celebrated evolutionist and cultural anthropologist, sees ornament as a universal language of images. He calls it picture language, Bildsprache, articulated by a series of elementary words, Grundwörter. And it is better spoken, he says, by tribal cultures or the people of nature, yet uncorrupted by civilization. The process that allows this language to be understood by everyone is empathy, Einfühlung, the universal validity of which Selenka deduces from his readings of the theories of the German psychophysicist and aesthetician Theodor Lipps. We understand all ornament as a universal language through our bodies, as long as we know how to use its basic forms or words. Tribal peoples know how to speak those words better than us in their proximity with nature, as opposed to civilized men. Selenka then uses Semper's three categories of ornament: rings, pendants and directional ornaments, and further ornament them to articulate their language, and then he adds to them his own words by doubling the Semperian categories from 3 to 6, as you see here. Here's, for example, a page spread in which all 3 Semperian categories are exposed. On the left, pendants become the long hairbraids of the Indian fakir. Rings on the center proportionally divide the body of an African woman. And finally, directional headdress from the Tibetan lamas on top right measures the speed of Eastern orientation. The military advantages of directional ornaments would further be illustrated by the feathered headgear of Pueblo natives and Malaysian warriors. The proportional properties of rings would be extended to the anklets and structurally enhancing anklets and toe rings worn by the Tamil women in India. The cosmic impact then of Semperian ornamentation would literally expand from head to toe. The protruding foot was an example of how the author could demarcate a cultural territory, both as inclusion and exclusion, by using the inorganically enhanced periphery of the body. Yet this was a culturally contested territory that was becoming increasingly difficult to navigate, and even the Semperian Richtungsschmuck could offer no reliable direction. Interestingly enough, the 3 additional categories Selenka proposes are essentially ornamental replications of superficial extensions of the 3 main Semperian ornamental types, starting with the Ansatzschmuck, an appendix or an additional ornament, a peripheral expansion or an inflation of the head or the shoulder ornaments, and second, the localized yet free-floating color patch, der lokale Farbenschmuck, such as flowers were in the head, and third, the final additional category is the Kleidungsschmuck, or fabric ornament, which mainly replicates the 3 main categories in textile material. A male tie, for example, is a fabric pendant. The turban is a fabric ring. One could add here the Pickelhaube Überzeug, a fabric cover attached to the helmet during the Great War as a form of camouflage, since the shine of the original helmet made its carrier as easier target for the enemy and rather vulnerable. The process of camouflage perhaps attaches to the cycle of adornment as a whole, where ornament starts to disguise itself by the plainness of its unornamented other. Selenka seems to praise Japanese women, for example, who in their innate sense of decoration use only minimal schmuck and wear no jewelry, only a few hair ornaments, yet their kimono is a whole body Kleidungsschmuck, a textile adornment that replicates all other categories in fabric. This decorative simplicity might indeed be indicative of the end of ornament, as we think we knew it, even in its phenomenal world expansion. Selenka called his account a life history, a Lebensgeschichte of ornament, yet it is ultimately more of the presentiment of an afterlife following the end of ornamentation. This is 1900, remember? While praising the ornamental sensibility of non-Western peoples against the Westerners, whom he does not even include in his account, Selenka makes clear that finally the ornament of these people is the ornament of people, is finally of these people. And that is the world ornament of that peripheral and exotic world. Gradually, all of schmuck would become unschmuck, an unwieldy appendage that didn't belong anywhere. Instead of becoming universal, the ornament becomes rudimental, a detachable appendage or mere Ansatzschmuck. Perhaps it's no accident that the Selenka's decorated bride on his cover titled The Ornament of People, der Schmuck des Menschen, precisely as an additional Ansatzschmuck, an addition of an addition, an ideational protection by a mere rudiment that could ostensibly be removed. The luminous ring of letters presages the eclipse of ornament announced a few years later by another architect who, like Warburg and Selenka, was also a reader of Semper, and that is, of course, the architect Adolf Loos. Nevertheless, an eclipse never means an end, given especially ornament's funereal technique of periodic invisibility and resurgence. And so this ornamental story has a postscript, and I will finish in 5 minutes, I promise. In addition to an amateur anthropologist, Selenka was also a renowned biologist, a zoologist, and an evolutionist. Among Selenka's scientific colleagues was the evolutionist and pioneer animal ecologist and morphologist Carl Semper, who had in fact published some of Selenka's researches on natural history in Southeast Asia. Like Selenka, Carl Semper was also a marine biologist and had traveled extensively in East Asia before Selenka, bringing back a number of natural marine and terrestrial specimens. It turns out that this Carl Gottfried Semper is the nephew of the architect, as shown in the genealogical tree of the Semper family. And yet in the biographies and other accounts of the architect, this evolutionist nephew remains something of a lost relative. Like Selenka, Carl Semper also wrote 2 books on memoirs with ethnographic observations from his trips to the Philippines and the German colonies, like the Palau Islands and Southeast Asia, that were widely read and reprinted in Germany, even during the Great War. In these accounts, the ecologist makes numerous observations on the dress, the decoration, the hairstyles of the natives in full ornamental detail, reminiscent of the detailed descriptions of dress and adornment in the text of Carl Semper's uncle Gottfried. Carl then, in his close acquaintance with Selenka, could have perhaps been the one who suggested to the zoologist to read the essay of his uncle on Schmuck and consult the architect's study on the physical basis of human decoration. Yet the evolution of this story continues from Selenka's side. As an evolutionist, Selenka was in fact the scientific authority on the evolution of primates, which might partly explain why Selenka's baby ape mascot appears so frequently among the anthropologist's memoirs from his travel, the publication of which precedes his little book on ornament or Schmuck. Selenka traveled to these territories with his wife Margarete Lenore Heinemann, an amateur ethnographer and anthropologist herself, here presented only by an L as co-author of the book. Combining scientific with political activity, Lenore Selenka eventually became one of the most well-known German feminists of her era, as well as a pacifist, put under house arrest in World War I, and demonstrating that not only the biological, but also the cultural and sexual and political revolutions of the human species was far from acquiring a definite state. Selenka, and after his death in 1902, his wife, in fact, edited a multi-volume series of studies on the subject of primates, pithecanthropy or Menschenaffen, including comparative detailed analysis of skull and jaw structure, drawing on X-ray photography, as in this symmetrical ornament arrangement of the lower jaw of an orangutan. A later addition to this series is a volume titled On the Directionality of Hair in Ape Embryos, über die Richtung der Haare in den Affenembryonen, a detailed study of hair growth patterns in all known species or primate embryos. Animal hair moves either in a radial or in a spiral direction from a center. They form lines and streams that move like electrical currents that can converge or diverge. Scientists follow the direction of hair to their endpoint in the extremities, tail, face, bailey, and anal orifice to discover multiple centers of hair growth, which are located differently in each species. The decisive difference was again in the detail, the devilish minutiae down to the level of follicles. The entire animal body turned into a field of arrows. Direction was now grafted on the textural layer of the skin. Extremities, such as toes and fingers, seem to provide an outlet for that proliferating energy to be channeled back into the world. Hair, in this case, is still a cosmic directional ornament in the Semperian sense. The layered extremity turns into a cosmic body that communicates with the outer world. Perhaps then, in this regressive detail, we can decipher ornament's modern transformation into a surface of continuous excitation, a stream of flows moving in multiple directions that turn the body into a landscape of electrostatic effects. From the linear symmetry of man and his orderly adornment, to the directional flow of the monkey's hair. A regressive evolution had occurred that diagrams the reflexive direction of ornament's modern texture as an expanded, animated field. Ornament had not disappeared. It simply returned into the world by regressing back into its origin and folding back into the skin. From Semper's orthogonal axis to Selenka's spiral motifs, we watch the transformation of adornment from a gravitational object in the world into a weightless surface that covers the globe. Ornament was no longer a figure in front of a background, but the background itself, envisioned as a network of forces whose dynamic flows and directionalities revolved around a void that was there from the origin, yet progressed circuitously to a vertiginous end. Kodak. Moderne, conventionnel, neu. Modern, conventional, new is the word today, end quote, says Selenka in the conclusion to his book on ornament. The new generation has, quote, cleaned up ornament, end quote, which is now part of the museums. The evolutionist blames modern science for the demise of ornament and the increased circulation it has produced, like Warburg. All these disorienting means of traffic throw men up against each other in a distorted multitude of conflicted images and ideas. So there's no physical or mental space anywhere for the individualizing contours of bodily adornment. To recover ornament, man has to look back to nature and the landscape, says Selenka, the forest, the sea, or the coral reefs that the scientists had visited. Ornament had returned back into the cosmos, the clouds, the galaxies, and the stars of the firmament, from which it enveloped the Earth. But could, in fact, Selenka's nostalgic or even parochial lament could reveal something essential about ornament's modern condition, which is that ornament had not disappeared, but had dissolved into the landscape in an attempt to fulfill its repressed ecological potential. Yet such expansive ecological return, I would argue, occurs not on the landscape of nature or the celestial heavens, but the highly iridescent and uniformly decorated background of the technological metropolis. Unlike Selenka, who opts to limit ornament in nature, and which eventually allows theories like laws to entirely extricate it from modern civilized culture, one could rediscover the ornament into the generalized afterglow, emanating from the inorganic smoothness of ornament's new mediatized habitat. There are no rings anymore, no pendants, no directions. Only an animated field of constant yet variegated excitation that moves frantically into multiple directions, the aporetic sign of an animated epistemology of the surface. The human subject is no longer the carrier, der Träger of adornment, but the follower, who is being carried away by his or her inorganic extensions. As an ideographic remnant of the past, the oscillating epistemological periphery of the world might still be represented by a pendulum. Yet that pendant no longer hangs from the ear of a human carrier and does not obey any gravity or Schwerkraft. It is instead suspended obliquely in mid-air, propped by the very sheer buoyancy of its own shine. Thank you.
Spyros, thank you very much for this very nice lecture, this meandering lecture from context to context. I think I didn't promise too much in my introduction. I think we can call it an ornamental lecture, maybe? Not an ornamented lecture. So please, if there's any question, comments, please.
Thank you very much. I thought of this lecture rather as a fetishistic lecture about the return of the repressed. Mm-hmm. And the author, which I was somewhat missing in there, was Flügel, who I think made a very interesting movement, because you interpreted in the very beginning a military adornment as a kind of phallic replacement for castration, right? The atrophy of the arm is kind of replaced in this huge adornment. Now, I think that Flügel made a very interesting statement. He was saying the male, after the French Revolution, which leads to the great male renunciation, the male renounces ornament in order, you could say in modern terms, so that the penis becomes the phallus. It's a vertical thing, there's no distinction. Whereas in the ornament, you keep the distinction between the phallic, I mean the body turning into a fetishist movement. And I think the interesting thing with Flügel was that he put that onto the gender divide. Yeah. And if you look around, I mean, women are still pretty much ornamented, and men, the only ornament they have got is their tie, basically. Yeah. So I think that within, unfortunately, this is my question, within our societies, I think you very beautifully kind of reintegrated the ornament into the non-intentional city. Yeah. But I wonder whether this divide between ornament as Verbrechen and whether this is not very much still within our
absolutely. It's introjected, this kind of prohibition, right? We're never going to get out of it as a kind of superego that now we might transgress in some way, but it's definitely there. I'm very glad you mentioned Flügel, but he's part of another chapter. And it's fantastic in a kind of more philological note. He used the illustrations of Selenka. But he never once mentioned Semper. So Selenka is based on Semper, and he's mentioned Selenka. That's a kind of ornamental deterioration of the references, right? But he never once mentioned Semper. And then Lacan, in the 7th century, mentions Flügel, right? And he is a standard reference for all the psychoanalytically sort of trained historians, and it's a wonderful, psychology of clothing. I would absolutely, and I couldn't put it better, as you said, there is, and I think even Jörg's dissertation on the return of the repressed, it's precisely that. The prohibition happened. We're never going to get out of it. But we can periodically, the prohibition also allows you to return, right? And revisit ornament in another guise. One of the conclusions of the guys with regressive evolution is that we never exactly return back to the same point. Never. We are going to return to something that looks like what we once were, but it's not the same, right? So we can never return to a pre-Laws era, right? We are in a post-Lawsian type of ornament. But that, again, allows us we have some degree of freedom, new ornamental cultures. But thank you.
Verschiedene, ja. Chris? Okay. Where they come.
Yeah, thank you. That was very revealing, your paper. You didn't mention Darwin. In his sexual selection book, he argued that the human being becomes a human being by becoming an artist. Because the human being is the only animal that is able to shape his skin from hair, so that the human being becomes able to paint on his own body. So the definition in the sexual selection book by Darwin of a human being is that this animal becomes an artist. I was very stunned by your last ornaments of the rhythm of the hair in apes. So this is against the differentiation between human being and animal, because the direction of the hair is already artistic in a sense.
Right.
Yeah. So I think this argument is very revealing and very provoking, and I bring that forward because I continuously discuss with biologists and physicists who argue against it. In a German frame, you would always go instinctively against the comparison between animal and biological and human. And the discussion you brought forward goes against this distinction. I have sympathy for that, but there is a question.
Yes, there is, definitely. And, I mentioned Darwin in terms of the origin of the species in his writings about rudiments, which were absolutely essential, and especially the Belgian anthropologist and sociologist answer, in a way, to Darwin. But this, even the sort of ecological practice of ornament that we see in birds, that is selecting materials from their environment to enhance their own bodily circumference, is an animal practice. Currently, I'm working on a text on another context on Frederick Kiesler's Magic Architecture, which is about the origins of human housing. And the first two chapters are on animals, in fact, on termites and on beavers. And he wants to locate precisely the instinctual building ability of man, in fact, to animal capacities for building. So I do think there is a reflexive sort of relationship between animal and human in practices of decoration. No, I would not distinguish that. Not that to abrogate, to sort of eliminate distinctions here, but I do think there is a reflexive return, and that's what my ape example tried to show.
It's the ants who invent the arch. right? With Kistler. Yes,
Oh, yeah,
very
yeah,
nice,
yeah, wonderful.
It's,
The
it's not a
art
human
made by
invention,
Jan.
but it's a, yes. Please, I think you had a question or comment.
Thank you, Spyros. That was fascinating. I wanted to pick up on something that you said toward the end of the lecture, but I think was kind of woven throughout, which is the relationship between ornament and function. It seems to me that at the moment that you're writing about sort of end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, the relationship between ornament and function has become such that ornament is something that's supposed to be additional to or beyond or post function. Now, obviously, if you think about ornament in that way, there is a kind of lurking functionalism that gets attached to ornament, both within biology and anthropology, right? And this is also a moment in which anthropology is thinking by reference to biology, to the extent that certain kinds of rituals are only functional in as much as they are artifactual of something that used to be functional but is no longer, right? That's what becomes of ornament in anthropology at that time. So my question is, if you're going to think about ornament as an aesthetic category, is there a way to do that without reference to function?
At all. Yes, I'm tempted. But it's very hard, even in these, Schaugeräte, the display vases and other things, they display a major function. I mean, maybe more symbolic one, different than actually using the vase to eat or for another utilitarian. And what I see is the changing of function. It's no longer made for one thing, and also the function becomes more visibly more marked visibly, right, in visual terms. And that's another development. I'm very fascinated, in fact, with these parts of rudiments or organisms that you're not sure what the function is. That, as I said, they're just hanging there. And yet, they act almost like, to use psychoanalytic terms, enigmatic signifiers. They're extremely potent without exactly knowing why. And that, I find, that might be the other ornament you're talking about, which is beyond standardized functions or beautifications that enhance functions. Right? But I'm definitely interested in this notion of function as something very, not in the strict utilitarian sense.
There's a question here.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I have two, I don't know if they are really interrelated questions. The first is, I was wondering, as a philologist, if we really can translate Schmuck with adornment entirely, 100%. I'm not sure. I'm not a native speaker of both languages, but I was wondering all the time if this is completely, I guess, beyond this, there is, to me, Schmuck sounds not related to a function, and adornment from the Latin is more connected to a material support, right? I guess I'm not entirely sure, but again, I'm not a native speaker of both languages.
And me neither.
Precisely for but precisely for that reason, we are. Both external observers.
Sometimes I think,
so
as I said,
we,
in this peculiar use of etymology, I think non-native speakers sometimes.
Ornamental being human beings. And the second question is more, you mentioned very marginally allegory, right? At a certain point towards the end of your talk. I would be fascinated. I mean, I think this is could be one of the important things, and I immediately thought of Walter Benjamin and allegory as this kind of enigmatic, impossible, giving a meaning to things which actually do not have an established meaning by the intention of the authors.
No, that's wonderful, and let me start with the second. Because it's an opportunity to kind of give a tribute to someone who's very important to me. When I started working on this essay on ornament, that actually delayed my book by 5 years because I thought that it's going to be part of it, an animation, but then decided that it's something different. I was at the Getty with Angus Fletcher, the literary critic whose work is very important to me, and his book on allegory is very, very important. And that's exactly where I saw this allegorical use of ornament, and especially the use of the cosmos. And so that was important to me. What allegory could do is, to come back to the last question, is precisely to destabilize somehow the meaning of ornament, as precisely Benjamin does in the Trashville essay. The other use that I have of allegory, and of Benjamin as well, is that I have these masses and piles of literature on ornament, which are impossible to read. I mean, there are 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 items in that bibliography that anyone who attempts to read those is never going to write anything in the end. So Benjamin says that very clever thing in the allegory essay in the Trash Bill, that criticism precisely erodes instead of enhancing the object of criticism. I think that's precisely what happens with the literature on ornament. They eat up the ornament, they bury it before Adolf Loos does. It's already in the ground. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, this funereal practice is part of the inherent logic of ornament. It buries itself to preserve itself. And that's the way, that's the allegory, in fact, that we see happening throughout the 20th century.
Well, this is almost the end. Is there any question here? I think this is, yeah?
Sorry, this is so fascinating. Thank you so much. But my perspective on ornament, I am a literary historian, and I am interested in observing the ornament within a text. And in my view, for reasons I cannot explain here, it is my thesis, my hypothesis that the ornament always contradicts the object. It's in a strong dialectical...
Or even the subject that wears it.
Right.
That was exactly Warburg's problem. The Beiwerk does things that the subject cannot control. It does things against nature, gegen die Natur.
Right.
And he says that very explicitly. The Beiwerk is this kind of the animate extension that doesn't obey the human logic. It moves in a way contradictory to what the Träge wants it to do. Right? So that's a contradiction.
Okay, this
one of my fellows, Stephen.
Thinking a bit more broadly, what is the relationship of ornament to propaganda? And even more strongly, isn't all ornament propaganda in the sense that it has a context, it has a demography, it has a historical context, it even has an ideology, unless of course we're talking about apes and their natural hair. But human ornament, we cut our hair, we don't leave our hair naturally. I don't think so. Ornament and propaganda.
Okay, you give me the opportunity to say something about the whole appendix to this book that I had to cut off for this lecture. Otherwise, I would keep you here for another half an hour, and you don't want that.
I'm here. Go ahead.
So, the last chapter is actually an unpublished, unrealized, universal history of schmuck by Hans Hildebrand, written between 1936 and 38, with a contract from the Propyläen Verlag during the Nazi era. And there you can see, on the one side, the sort of use of ornament as a world study of different cultures across the world. And on the other side, on the very flip side of these newspaper clippings that he has, you would see the kind of expansion of decorative culture by the National Socialists. The same by Goebbels, by Hitler, and by others. And also the sort of miraculous, almost rediscovery of swastikas around the German land, precisely at that era, used exactly as propaganda. I think the Third Reich is an example, and that's why the book finishes. While it starts with some political examples, as I said, of Wilhelm's the last Kaiser, it returns to that political climate and ends there with the Third Reich. But I wanted to mention that that's a world ornament too, but it's the exact opposite of what I'm talking about. That is, from a centripetal to from a centrifugal to a petal kind of understanding of the proliferation of ornament, and it's centralizing to one major source that it's then going to expand globally around the world. That's the horrifying dark side of the world ornament I'm writing about, and I'm conscious about it, and it's part of propaganda as well, and it definitely has to be part of the book.
But how about even more subtly, like those of us in this room, we dress a certain way. We're not in Roman togas, we're dressed in the way we're dressed. And it might not be as extreme as Nazi propaganda, but in its own way, we're emblematic of a time, a place, a context, and even an ideology in a way. So in a more extreme example, isn't all ornament propaganda in a way?
I would say increasingly it becomes more difficult to assign a certain type of either ornament or clothing to only one ideology or one cultural meaning. There's a proliferation of them and it becomes more and more unstable. It becomes disguise, camouflage, where you dress exactly the opposite of what you believe as a form of reaction. So if it is, indeed, it is an ideological instrument for sure, but I wanted to mention the kind of versatility and sometimes the elusiveness of forms of clothing and of adornment as well. And using precisely adornment, the accessorizing of the self, in sometimes a very contradictory way than the way that you dress, right? To achieve a certain either personal or other identity or collective identity as well.